I'm going to be doing a presentation on a game design that I've been working on myself for a couple of years now, as an example of a number of things. The presentation I'm doing today is something that I adapted from what I did at the beginning of the month to the Military Scholarship of Teaching and Learning Forum that was hosted by Marine Corps University. But I think it still works as sort of a more general presentation, looking at an example of a way to design a game as a professional military educational tool, or you could look at the framework I used, for non-military education if you wanted to, but also trying to address some specific issues and challenges in designing a game that not only works for a military audience, but has both the richness and crunchiness of a deeper war game in a form factor that does not take up half of a room. In fact, something that you can literally put into your cargo pocket, as I have mentioned here in the initial slide. So probably take me about 30 to 40 minutes for all the content here. I apologize up front. I do tend to sort of talk fast, but I talk fast when I get excited about something. And given that this is something I've been working on for a couple of years, I feel very excited about it. I poured my heart and soul into it, if you will. So I hope, at least in my excitement, everybody can keep up. Quick looking at what we're going to be talking about today. Quick introduction for myself, for those who I haven't met yet. I currently work as a war game analyst at Group W. I'm recently-ish retired Marine Corps helicopter pilot. I've also done work as a forward air controller and requirements officer in the Marine Corps, deployed to a number of places. And my last job in the Marine Corps was as the operations officer for the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, which wargaming was a big part of what I did there. And it was a fantastic experience getting to help find ways to integrate wargaming into educational curricula. I've written a few things. I also act as a co-host for a different lecture media podcast series over at War on the Rocks. For anyone who's a membership over there, you can listen to that. And then I'm also, as this presentation shows, I dabble in game design. I have a previously published or released game in the Indo-PACOM micro game collection, and Sebastian Bay, one of the other Wargaming Community Practice leads here at MORS, put that whole thing together. The game is called Popeye and the Goo. It's focused on moving supplies using assault support aviation in a expeditionary advanced base environment where your main challenge is the highly unpredictable weather of the Indo-PACOM region. Maneuver Warfare is a game we're going to talk about today. And then in the pipeline, once I get Maneuver Warfare sort of off my back, I have a prototype that I'm working on where it's a sensor fusion game looking at intercepting unidentified aerial phenomena, or what we used to call UFOs, and whatever those things are today. The game's going to help you go find them. All right, usual disclaimer. These opinions and views here are mine alone, do not represent the policies or views of any associated institutions with which I am affiliated. And also, Maneuver Warfare, the card game, although it is flavored by elements of Marine Corps doctrine and broader military concepts, it is in no way endorsed or supported by the Marine Corps Defense Department or any other agency of the U.S. government. And also, the images, it's a very image-heavy presentation, but these are not the final formats for the cards that I'm actually working on, the new ones right now with the game designer. Okay, so kind of how did this whole thing all start? Before there were research questions, how did the game concept sort of get into my brain? And I'd say things kind of really started with when I came over to the Krulak Center in 2019. There was sort of a call to action about wargaming across the Marine Corps, something that the previous Commandant, General David Berger, had noted in his Commandant's planning guidance. I saw a lot of that call reinforced in different places around the Marine Corps when I was over at Marine Corps University. And a lot of the sort of the response to that call to action from PME students, as well as in Marines, both Marines, but also other services and allies and partners that we were interacting with, is, yeah, we see the value of wargaming. We want more of it, which is great, right? However, there was also kind of a related challenge with this call to action, which is that in a world where wargaming or Marines want more wargaming, and the commandant on down is saying, "Hey, I want you to do more of this because I think it's a useful tool." Wargaming tends to compete with other requirements that Marines have to devote their time to. So getting buy-in from Marines and Marine leadership to dedicate time to it. I've sort of believed in other fellow travelers in this area, like Sebastian Bay and some other folks around the fleet. We believe that war games should be accessible to Marines, relevant to Marine or other military service missions, and emotionally and intellectually engaging, or in other words, quote unquote, fun. But a further challenge in this is that there's not a lot of games out there that are sort of designed to hit all those wickets. So, in sort of fine Marine Corps fashion, my solution was to try and develop a potential option myself. From my past background doing research and writing on maneuver warfare doctrine, which for those not aware, that's the underlying combat philosophy for the Marine Corps, first encapsulated in Fleet Marine Force Manual 1 that came out in 1989, revised in Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1 that came out in 1997, both of which were called Warfighting. I wanted that philosophy, that warfighting philosophy, to be the overall theme of the game. I also wanted the game to focus on challenges of future conflict, both in the context of the force design changes happening across the Marine Corps, but also based on what I was seeing in conflicts, both sort of cold and hot around the world, and especially in Ukraine. So I took that initial mantra of accessible, relevant, and fun, merging it with something that focused on maneuver warfare doctrine, as well as the challenges of future conflict. I found myself with several questions about game design that I would need to answer to make a useful PME tool. So to sort of frame those questions, or the questions that I felt I needed to answer, are the ones that you see here. So first off, how do you design a piece of educational technology to make war games accessible to Marines based on the austere locations they often deploy to, so that they can do all of the reps and sets, which is one of those buzzwords about how to do good wargaming. You do a lot of it repeatedly. How to make a game where they could do that while facing the resource constraints that they would in an expeditionary environment. Second, how do you make a game that's relevant by gamifying by doctrine that people have to know and care about, and gamifying future war concepts into something tactile? And then finally, to add to the relevance, how can you make Marines or others in a military audience familiar with emerging technology like artificial intelligence when that technology has not yet been proliferated widely across the Marine Corps or the DoD? Everybody talks about it, says they want more, but it's not something that's really integrated or incorporated yet at scale. But it's something that's worth introducing, and if there's a chance to do that in a war game, how can that be done? All right, so going to question one in the game design here. To answer that question, I really had to think about what are some of those constraints that limit, the literal sort of size, form factor, and sort of the burden I can place on the players for what they need to actually play the game. So for anyone who's been forward deployed, a lot of these constraints are going to sound familiar. You may not have any computers, period. If you have computers, you may not have access to the internet, which makes any network gaming or any game that requires plugging back into a server somewhere else. You can't play that type of game. And another challenge is space, and that can be space for either playing the game itself or the space required to store game boxes, maps, dice counters, all the little components that make up the game. So as both a gamer myself and a Marine who deployed many times to these austere locations, I was very aware that an expeditionary game required the most minimalist approach possible. Minimal number of components, a small physical footprint, and zero dependence on having computer networks or even a computer. At best, I would count on a austere location having at least a flat surface of some kind and a light source. Beyond that, I also knew from my own deployments that there is one genre of games that Marines have played just about anywhere they go, which only need a flat surface and a light source, and that genre is card games. My approach was, card games are really the ultimate minimalist game because you only have one component, the cards. There's no dice, cardboard counters, or other tokens that can wander off and make the game, unplayable if you lose them. It's kind of hard to play, a battalion in combat if you've lost half the battalion game chits. The other nice thing about card games is that they're small enough to be literally carried in one's pocket. In that context, the cargo pockets on a Marine's utility uniform are almost luxuriously roomy. So these elements shape the expeditionary form factor for my game design. Cards would be the only components. The number of cards needed to play the game would be kept under control so that you could fit the entire game literally into your cargo pocket. And the layout of the game's physical footprint needed to be compact enough that it could be reasonably played on a modest-sized flat surface. This is something that I successfully tested in a number of places, to include the tailgate of my pickup truck and the parking lot of my daughter's cheer gym. All right, so going in, the second design question here is relevance. How do you gamify doctrine and future war concepts into something tactile, as well as something that's got a minimalist design approach to it? So I wanted to incorporate a number of military concepts in my game. Sort of at the outset, one of those concepts is the very deliberate thought process that service members put into thinking about how they intend to defeat their opponent and what assets they need to achieve that goal. We know all this as the military planning process. In the Marine Corps, it's McPeepee, and the Army, it's MDMP, I believe, and every service sort of has their own flavor of it, but every service does it, is the point. And as it happens, learning your service's planning process is also a key element of PME courses, regardless of rank. There are many factors to consider in the planning process, and that includes your adversary's likely course of action, their most dangerous threat systems, but also what specific goals you may be asked to achieve on the friendly side, what assets you think you will need to achieve those goals. And then there's also the hedging process, right? You got to make an estimate of what you think you need to bring along as a hedge against other things your opponent might bring that you may not necessarily be aware of. And you cannot bring everything. As much as the U.S. military likes to, usually you can't. And this factor is especially important to Marines who need to make hard decisions about what fits on the amphibious lift that's available to them. All right, so this planning process feeds into decisions about force design and task organization. And again, as it happens, there is a style of card game that I already had a lot of familiar with that captures these types of decisions, and that is the deck construction type game. There's a number of different flavors of deck construction out there today. The one that I got most familiar with in my younger days was the Star Wars card game that came out in the 1990s. And as I reflected on that style of game with all the intervening years in between from my time in military service, I realized that this style of the deck construction style was a great fit for gamifying the military planning process and task organization. And again, using the Star Wars card game as an example, in that game, you could only bring 60 cards to the table. And all the decisions in which cards you included were the manifestation of your assessment of your opponent, your strategy, or your bid for victory, and all of those hedging bets of capabilities you might need just in case. So the deck construction genre was a good choice for getting players to grapple with planning considerations before the contest against your opponent even started. Of course, as I said, I wanted the overall theme of the game to be bringing maneuverable warfare doctrine to life. So once players created their task forces, or in other words, built their decks, I wanted the gameplay to bring that doctrine to life, to make it tactile, to make it into something players could feel and observe with their senses, so that it would resonate in their thinking mind in a way that was more memorable than simply reading the words off the page of the warfighting publication you see there. So my game design process went about this in a few ways. First, I took maneuver warfare's definition of war as a clash of human wills in an extremely literal sense, and I made the destruction of the adversary's will the victory condition for the game. How this was manifested in the game actually went through several iterations based on playtesting feedback, and probably the biggest shift in iteration came earlier this summer when I was at the Origins Game Conference, and it was based on I owe Dr. James Starrett and Tom Violot a lot of kudos for that, because their input for how will was used in the game helped me unlock another component of maneuver warfare doctrine that I had not actually included up to that point, and I felt a little bit guilty about, but I just hadn't found a good way to do it. But they helped me unlock it. So and I'm going to talk about that other component shortly. So the underlying mechanic for will remained the same largely across my design iterations. However, you start with a fixed repository of will. You attack your opponent's will by different methods to reduce it to zero, and you do your best to protect or regenerate your own will to fight. A note on the explanation of the imagery that I used on the cards that track this. This is something I actually crowdsourced across my social media networks when I was struggling to figure out just how to use pictures to illustrate the concept of will to fight, because that's kind of a nebulous concept to begin with. I couldn't really come up with an answer myself that satisfied me, so I asked Miltwitter, how would you capture national will to fight? And that's something that encompasses both the military and its supporting society. How do you capture that in one picture? There was a lot of really good back and forth, and then one person nailed it. This person noted that perhaps, with one of the most potent images of national commitment, at least from the U.S. side over the last 20 years, was the soldier or the Marine or the sailor or what have you bidding farewell to their loved ones before getting on a plane or a boat to go to war. The nation's investment was so strong that it was willing to break up the family, the core unit of social organization, to achieve national goals. So that's what my version of will to fight became. And the images I used touched on how I wanted players to envision that will. What's the impact? What's the output of that will in the real world? But along with this depiction of will, I also wanted to capture the human cost. And this is why the second will tracker card that I'm going to show here in a second continually covers up the faces beneath to remind the players that lost will is often caused by death and destruction on the battlefield, and those losses all have human faces. And so when a player's will finally gets close to zero, that's when the second will tracker card here, which rotates throughout the game, finally tilts completely upright, and then the image of coffins being carried inside an aircraft becomes blindingly obvious. I want to be clear that I didn't do this to be ghoulish or to make light of human suffering. Even though this is a game, I wanted players to realize that at the end of the day, this game is a representation, however abstract, of the horrible realities of war. That horrible reality means death, and not just death of the adversary, but death of your own people. Too often, war games only manifest casualties in a highly abstract sense. For example, your unit's destroyed, you remove a token from the board, and that's that. When players take losses in my game, the human aspect of that loss is front and center every time they move their will tracker. It may make players uncomfortable, and frankly, I hope it does, because I don't think service members should ever be entirely comfortable with the idea that their decisions on the battlefield are without a human consequence. All right, I think we've dwelt on that for some time, so we're going to move on to other ways of capturing maneuver warfare doctrine within the game. In some instances, this is a pretty straightforward line. For example, when Marine Corps Doctrine Publication 1 talks about striking power and resisting power in the offense and defense, I simply turn those into unit attributes based on a unit's organic firepower and resilience. In other instances, like the concepts of focus and friction in war, I turn the concept into its own unique category of card. MCDP1 talks about focus as a convergent of effort. So I made focus cards that represent how an investment in a specific area over time can have the convergence of that investment manifested as superior battlefield performance in a specific realm. However, if you don't make that investment beforehand, before the balloon goes up and you're called to go somewhere, you don't get the benefit of that convergence in the moment, right? If you don't train your NCOs in peacetime, they're not going to magically flip a switch of leadership in wartime. Conversely, friction, as noted by Clausewitz, are those multitude of unpredictable factors that make even the simplest task on the battlefield difficult. And so, again, creating a different category of cards, the friction cards in the game become those unpredictable things that you can throw against your opponent to disrupt their decision-making cycle and upset their plans. Maneuver warfare also notes that Marines can't predict what adversary they might face at any given time, and so must be adaptable in their own capabilities and force structure, as well as remain aware of developments from conflicts in the world around them, even if the United States is not currently directly involved. And so, hence, blue's force structure in my game is borrowed from the Marine Corps and elements of the other services. And then red is a mixture of Russia, China, and some non-state violent extremist organizations thrown in for good measure. Beyond existing force structures, I regularly scan the news for developments in new technologies or the novel employment of existing technologies on fields of conflict around the world. It was an unfortunate tragedy of history that I started working on this game in the midst of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But as a military professional at the time, I felt an obligation to learn what I could from the war to better understand what future conflicts for Marines might look like. And so my design process included the frequent building and updating of new cards based on what I was seeing in Ukraine so that players could ponder these insights within the game's context. So that's why the blue player gets access to a tractor towing team that can steal and repurpose red's armored vehicles, and why red has prison convicts who can act as bullet sponges to soak up battlefield damage. And then the leaky gamer card in the middle there, things go on, domestically in the United States as well. And so that just sort of captures things like our friend in the Air Force who decided to share classified documents on the Discord gaming application. All right. Another aspect of conflict that Marine Corps Maneuver Warfare Doctrine touches on is fog of war. Fog of war is a concept, like I said, it's in the doctrine. It's discussed in many different military training education syllabuses, as well as professional readings. So I wanted to include it in some fashion in my own game design. There is a practical difficulty in manifesting aspects of fog of war, such as hidden unit locations in a card game. And so I decided that my mechanic for incorporating it would be in the random number generator in the game, which basically works as the game's dice. Many card games have some kind of random number generator built into them. But I wanted players to think in a certain sense about strategizing randomness. So since I already had a number of different categories of actions in the game that required adjudication, I broke up the random number generator into 4 separate categories. So you basically got 4 different types of dice, and these are based on the actions that require adjudication. These numbers are the player's fog of war, since those cards are shuffled at the beginning of the game, and you don't see the numbers until you flip them face up to adjudicate an action. However, while fog of war and chance are present in any conflict, military planners also aim to bend probabilities in their favor wherever possible. So I included this as a strategizing option in the pre-game deck construction process. Fog of War is captured on the flip side of the action cards, and the action cards are your game's currency for doing things within the game. Your baseline deck construction numerics are you can have no more than 30 action cards with their attendant Fog of War numbers you see on the screen in your total deck size of 60. However, you can choose to have fewer action cards if you want, and you can replace those action cards with other combat units or other capabilities in your deck. So, for example, if you wanted a little bit more on the cyber or information side, you could say, I'm going to deliberately leave out 5 of my action cards and include 5 additional friction cards in the cyber information realm. That's your choice. Now, this consciously reduces your total sort of pot of actions available to you at any given time, but this is a choice that you make. So, however, for the remaining action cards, the players are free to decide which ones to keep within the example I just gave, right? You still get 25 cards. You get to pick which 25 you want to keep. And so you can choose, which of those numbers are going to help you the most. So, for example, if your deck is built on a firepower heavy theory of victory, of those 25 cards, you're going to pick the ones that have the highest numbers left remaining to you to ensure that when you draw one to adjudicate a long range strike action, you're hopefully you should get a higher number. However, you're also accepting more randomness in all those other numbers in the game. But again, that's your call. That's all about what you decide is important in the trade-offs from when you're designing your task force, building your deck. And that's a choice that any leader at almost any level has to make in war. So even randomness becomes part of your strategy in this game. All right. Maneuver warfare doctrine also notes, like I said before, Marines can be called to fight in unexpected battlefields, any climb and place, right? Just like the hymn says. Modern joint nomenclature has described conflict today as multi-domain. And whether you sort of like that verbology or not, that's what I incorporated in the game since it's what's currently used. So the domains become the places in which you fight. So the maritime, land, space, and information domains are all present here as distinct domain cards, with the air domain, where your aircraft fly, assumed to exist permanently, essentially above all of the terrestrial domains that are on the table, and a subsurface domain always existing permanently beneath any of your maritime domains. I delineate between strictly land-based terrain and urban domain for specific reasons, which I'll talk more about here in a second. So to present players with the uncertainty inherent in preparing for any military operation, you don't always know where you're going to go. My mechanic for building the battlefield with the domain cards is semi-randomized. Before the game begins, both players get to select a handful of domains that support their deck's theory of victory. So if you created a deck that's heavy on ground combat power, you're going to look for opportunities to deploy that ground combat power where it works for you. So in your pre-game selection, you should pick multiple land domains where your ground combat power can operate. However, once both players do this, there then follows a random selection from the remaining domain cards that are then inserted across the other player domains to break up the clean ideal battlefield into something unexpected, something where you're going to have to great. You've got lots of ground combat power, but you've got like a small lake or a large ocean in between. Well, you may have some key terrain that's on the other side of that ocean. How are you going to get there? And that gets into forcing you to think about those hedging things that you need to build into your task force or your deck that you're going to have to deal with, because we don't, like I said, we don't always get to fight where you want to. The only exception to this randomized laydown is in the space and information domains. Those are mandatory in every game's domain laydown, so both players have to plan for them. On top of this, I added a few different wrinkles, again, often based off of events from ongoing conflicts. There are some terrestrial domains that are destructible terrain, such as a nuclear power plant or a hydroelectric dam. You can thank Putin for that. So in these places, players who are careless in applying firepower risk destroying those domain features and permanently altering the landscape for the rest of the game. You blow the dam, you have flooded that terrain, and you destroy everything that's in that domain, even if it's friendly, right? That's what happens when you throw missiles around, fragile infrastructure. And then once that's all done, there's a special category of cards called domain variables that are placed on top of each of these and then revealed to see if they stick with the domain they land on. The domain variables capture those unexpected factors that both players have to adapt to. Severe weather, displaced populations, even solar flares affecting your communications networks. And it's just to drive the point home, even if you're fighting on in a domain where you wanted to fight, stuff happens that you don't necessarily plan for or get to control. However, complaining about it or not fighting at all is not an option. If it's freaking raining on a battlefield, you don't get to say that you're not going outside because it's raining. You still have to fight your way through it. Those are challenges in the real world, so I made the players do it too. And then finally, another consideration in designing these virtual battlefields was accounting for something that I feel a lot of war games historically either downplay or ignore, and that's the presence in a conflict zone of the flesh and blood human beings who actually live there. And in urban domain, especially, like urban is where the people live. Urban terrain in war games is often manifested in impacting player mobility of units going through it, or it gives you a defensive combat bonus because buildings and houses make great, fighting positions. But the human occupants of these places are often sort of, ignored or removed from consideration. But anyone watching the fighting ongoing now in Ukraine or Gaza knows that this sanitized version of the urban world is just fantasy. No matter how virtuous your cause or how careful you are in precision targeting within a town or city, choosing to fight in an urban area makes the people there suffer. So I designed my game's urban domains to capture both the very real defensive value and the mobility impact, that densely packed buildings cause, but also capture the suffering that's inflicted on the people who live there. Now, the flow of the game might drive players to occupy urban terrain. Again, they make good fighting positions, but should either the attacker or defender choose to initiate engagements there, it's going to negatively impact your reservoir of will, which is your victory condition for the game. Conversely, players in urban domains can leverage their logistics units to provide humanitarian aid to the humans who live there, and that can positively affect your will reservoir. You do good deeds, it boosts up your general will to fight. However, either way, the people who live in cities and towns matter, and players must account for them in both their deck construction strategy and the execution of their plans within the game. All right, last major element of gamifying maneuver warfare we'll touch on also touches on a core element of what wargaming proponents believe is perhaps the most valuable use of wargaming, and that's helping players develop better decision-making habits against an adversary who's actively making decisions against them to undermine their plan. Of course, players make decisions in every genre of wargame, but again, one of the underlying purposes is I'm trying to create a game that makes manifest concepts in a tactile fashion. How can you put something as intangible as a decision-making process on a physical game table and physically interact with it? So as it happens, maneuver warfare refers to a underlying decision-making cycle, the observation, orientation, decision, action loop, or OODA loop, developed by former Air Force Colonel John Boyd, whose own theories on conflict heavily influenced Marine Corps doctrine. And as I mentioned before, at Origins, Jim Sterrett and Tom Vielot had given me some thoughts on how to restructure my game, how it portrayed will to fight. And the output of this design change was that it gave me a chance to actually put the OODA loop into the game as something you can interact with. So as I mentioned before, your currency in the game are the action cards that you spend to do everything. As you expend your actions now with the OODA loop construct, your actions change their state throughout the loop. In expending your actions, you observe their results, and then you orient yourself on what's happened, both what's happened previously and your intentions for the future, to make decisions that you're going to implement in the next turn. So in the game, how do you get inside someone's OODA loop? Again, if you recall from an earlier slide, the definition of maneuver warfare: imposing on your enemy a variety of rapid, focused, and unexpected actions which create a turbulent and rapidly deteriorating situation with which the enemy cannot cope. Each successful action you take against an enemy, and you can see the list on the right-hand side there, your actions can have both a tactical effect on the battlefield, but also an effect of generating that turbulence inside your opponent's OODA loop. And in so doing, this is going to limit what actions the opponent can take on their next turn as they deal with the impacts of what you just did to them. This represents the mental shock of having bad things done to you that disrupt your own plans. And the greater number of shocks that are delivered to you, the more disruption that cognitive burden does to your ability to respond. And then at the same time, success begets success. The success of your own actions creates future opportunities for you to exploit. Thus, you may have a deeper, more promising set of decisions available to you in future turns by doing positive things on the battlefield. So this is the way the OODA loop functions in the game, as a physical manifestation of how a disrupted decision cycle limits future freedom of action, while an intact or enhanced decision cycle increases your future freedom of action. All right, going to, again, sort of I call it a question 2A because it's not really its own question, but it's another aspect of the relevancy, and that's making Marines familiar with emerging technology like artificial intelligence. So this may seem sort of ironic because a deck of cards itself is not high technology or something you would sort of associate with something like artificial intelligence. But I still wanted players to have a way to, I still wanted to include it in some fashion so that players had to grapple with it, had to incorporate it into their gameplay and their design process, or their planning process. So if you'll pardon me for butchering the English language a little bit, instead of putting AI in the game, I put AI on the game, on each and every card that Marines or other services, again, playing the game would touch. Get my lights back on here. So artificial intelligence, it's a disruptive technology. It's becoming more embedded in an ever-growing number of military and non-military applications. AI imagery has been part of that discussion in a number of ways, from creating deepfakes of real people to allowing those engaged in messaging campaigns to generate large volumes of unique images to support those campaigns. And there's a million use cases in between those two. So for me, creating a game where the visual image of the world came directly from this disruptive technology was the point. The players who I wanted to help educate in emergent and future battlefield trends would be holding an example of this in their hands with every single card that they played. In my case, the media was very literally the message. From my perspective, generative AI imagery worked to both offer a meta theme to players on one possible future application of AI. It also created the look of the future conflict environment that I was presenting in the overall game. I wanted the game to look somewhat ethereal, otherworldly, like a world that had things recognizable to the player, but also they just looked a little bit different or a little odd or made them feel uncomfortable to look at. To me, that's what the future fundamentally is. It is by nature otherworldly because it's not our world, and because we don't know how the future will unfold. The ways in which we imagine the world of the future can be different or odd or uncomfortable. All right. Final question, which wasn't on the original list, but which was the final, the point of the game, which is how do you make it fun? Which leads into some other questions, such as should you even bother to make it fun? Isn't fun and serious study two separate things? And also, again, war is a serious business. Things get destroyed, people die. So as it happens, among the theories of how you learn things, it turns out there's actually a large volume of literature that specifically talks about how wargaming is used as an intellectual tool, and emotional engagement is part of that. You can see some examples of the things here. And again, for anyone who happened to be at the M stall at Marine Corps University early in October, a number of their briefers talked about this specific thing, how the emotional engagement of wargaming works and makes the lessons resonate more deeply. And in tying it back to these learning theories, fun, call it what you want. Call it fun, call it emotional engagement. It allows learners to form deeper and longer lasting connections with the material than via more static or passive learning methods. So let's go back. I'm going to do kind of a brief review of what my game is trying to present to the players. Talked about pre-mission planning, task force organization, decision-making cycles, friction and fog of war, terrain considerations, will to fight, doctrine, military concepts, future concepts, emergent technology. That is a lot of information in a lot of different categories to consume. And even if consumed, its application may not be immediately evident, especially if you are drained of mental energy in the course of consuming all that information. But by gamifying this information, Marines can interact with it in a dynamic fashion and in a way that appeals to the natural competitiveness of Marines. Make it a contest. Make them fight on simulated battlefields to see which of them learn the information better, and then have them fight again and again to see who can adapt to new battlefields and new enemy plans. Marines, other service members love to compete, love to fight. And so one of the ultimate goals of this game is to put all of that information from doctrine to domains in a format where Marines, or again, other military service member audiences, can get the enjoyment of proving their mastery of the information over their fellows, and then have that fellow Marine say, "Hang on, Devil Dog, let's play that again."